Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the Great Decisions Foreign Policy Discussion Series for 2013. My name is Dr. Amy Richards. I work with programming for the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. Tonight is our 8th Great Decision Series session and the last one. So how many of you have perfect attendance? Who has 8 out of 8? Well done. Very good. How about 7 out of 8? Also very well done. Now, many of these people were gone a week for spring break, so that's the 7 out of 8. And 6 out of 8? Not bad. So thank you for being such faithful attenders. Tonight's session is a special collaboration with the West Michigan chapter of the Turnaround Management Association. So please raise your hand if you're a TMA member. Great. We're glad to see you here tonight. Several months back, Pat Mears, president of the board of directors for the West Michigan chapter of the Turnaround Management Association, he suggested that we collaborate with his group on a Eurozone topic. And it turned out to be a really natural relationship because this was one of our great decisions topics already. And so that's how we came about tonight with being the World Affairs Council and the Turnaround Management Association coming together for this collaborative event. So please join me in thanking Pat Mears and the Turnaround Management Association, the West Michigan chapter, for being our sponsors tonight. And Pat, would you please stand up? He's just here. Thank you so much. One last time, please fill out your ballots tonight. So for those of you who are with us for the first time, in your program you'll find a ballot with the issues regarding the euro or the Eurozone crisis tonight. We've had these for our last eight sessions where on whatever foreign policy issue, we have a chance to answer or make some suggestions about what the government should do about this. So please fill out the ballot, and you can place it in the box on your way out, or if you miss the box, just give it to one of the World Affairs Council staffs, and we will send these ballots on to, in the end, it's a report put together, and we send it on to Congress, the State Department, and the White House. So make your voice heard, and we'll send in your ballot. We almost made it through the Great Decision series without a severe weather-related incident. But alas, we do have one tonight. So one of our panelists, Dr. John McCormick, who is under a foot of snow in Indianapolis right now, he will be joining us by telephone and by his PowerPoint presentation as well. So our speakers, live and via phone link, will be able to lead us through understanding the Eurozone crisis. Dr. John McCormick, professor of European politics at Indiana University, Purdue University at Indianapolis, he will provide us with a primer on the Eurozone and the possibilities of the future of the euro. After Dr. McCormick speaks to us via phone link, then Professor John Pottow, professor of law at University of Michigan Law School, an expert in the field of bankruptcy, he will discuss the impact of the Eurozone crisis on the United States and particularly on Michigan industries, such as the auto supply industry. Our moderator for tonight is Dr. Gunther Hege. He's from the Department of Political Science at Western Michigan University. He will ask questions of Professor Pottow and Dr. McCormick, who will still be with us by phone. And then Dr. Hege will invite the audience to ask questions. You can come down to the microphones here and here to ask your questions. You could also text in your questions. So if you'll look in your program, there's a text number. You can send your question there. And we ask that you just give one question when you come to the microphone or send it by text so that more people will have a chance to ask a question tonight. So if you will, join me in please welcoming our panel to discuss Imperfect Union, the Eurozone in Crisis. We will begin with Dr. John McCormick, who is joining us by telephone. So good evening, Dr. McCormick.
Hello, Amy. Can you hear me okay? Good. All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm very sorry that I can't be there with you in person. We have what the police and the meteorologists call a weather event, which in practice means we've got the worst snowstorm we've had this time of the year for over 100 years. So that was really something we couldn't possibly plan for. So the theme this evening is imperfect union. I should begin by saying that there's no such thing as a perfect union, and even in the U.S. Constitution, all it says is that in order to achieve a more perfect union, the Constitution was written. So the European Union has always been imperfect, and it always will be imperfect. Unfortunately, the imperfections are showing themselves much more obviously at the moment than they have in the past. The first slide there, I just took some book covers off Amazon, and it gives you an indication of the kinds of conversations that people are having at the moment about the European Union. And you just look at those three covers, and you can see the kind of themes that we're talking about. The word crisis appears a lot in discussions about the European Union, but specifically about the Eurozone. And then I subscribe to The Economist, which I'm beginning to think is actually a really bad idea, because every week it arrives and it seems to be more and more depressing. But I put one of my favorite covers there showing, this is from 2 years ago actually, which just shows how long the crisis has been going on. But the theme there obviously is from Apocalypse Now, with Angela Merkel looking very glum at the bottom there, talking about the horror, and Europe's debt crisis spinning out of control. But that was 2 years ago, and things are still stumbling on. The thing hasn't collapsed in the way that many people said it would. But interestingly, I think when you get to the point where you have a book called The Euro Crisis for Dummies, it seems to suggest that things have become to a really new pass. Now, in terms of crises, I went back and looked at some of the crises that Europe has had over the years, and I put them there on that slide there. The first group, which ran from 1954 until the 1980s, there were multiple crises of one kind or another. One of the very first ones was before what is now the European Union was even created, when a plan to set up a European defense community collapsed in flames, almost literally. 1960s, Charles de Gaulle tried to keep Britain out of the European Economic Community, failed to do that. In the mid-1960s, France pulled itself out of the meetings of the European Economic Community institutions, and that led to the so-called empty chair crisis. There were failures to set up the single currency back in the 1970s. In the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher made herself difficult by demanding a reorganization of the European Economic Community budget. And then in the 1990s and 2000s, we've had various countries rejecting treaties. We had the embarrassing failure of the European Union in the Balkans to deal with the Balkan problem. And in 2005, the constitutional treaty, the attempt to set up the European constitutional treaty, collapsed after the French voted against it. And even then, people were saying this was the end of the European Union. My point here is that there have been crises all the way through. And Jean Monnet, in the next slide, Jean Monnet was one of the founding fathers of the European Economic Community, as it was called at that point. He warned that this would always be the case. You know, he said the building of Europe is a great transformation. It's going to take a long time. We're going to have a lot of problems, and we're going to have a lot of crises, and we really shouldn't consider these difficulties as failures. We have to keep working on them. So there have been a lot of problems. Now, why have there been so many problems? Well, I've suggested 5 different possibilities here. Number one, the European Union is a project without precedent. There's been nothing like it before, where a group of 27, soon to be 28 countries have come together and voluntarily given up some control over domestic policy and politics. And the result of this is it's really demanded a new way of thinking about how to approach political relationships, how to make economic policy, how to make policy in different areas. And in many cases, the European Union has been active in policy areas that it never anticipated from the start that it would be. Secondly, the European Union has been made up on the fly. There was a general idea we needed to have peace in Europe. The idea of a federal Europe, perhaps at some point in the future, some people talked about that. But there really was only a very general idea about the end goal or how to get there. And even today, people say, what is the European Union? There is no straightforward answer to that question. But we don't know what it is. We don't know how it's going to evolve even from now. There's all kinds of myths and misconceptions and pessimism associated with the European Union as a result of all of this. The third reason for the problems is that there's been a constant struggle between national interests of the member states and the European interest. And the national interests of the member states are relatively easy to define and understand. but in terms of defining what the European interest is and how that is different or similar from the national interest is very, very difficult. The fourth source of problems is that we have to remember, we have to remember that in spite of all of these problems, there have in fact been an enormous number of achievements. And it's very tempting to look at all of these problems and focus on them. And frankly, the media are very good at playing up the crises. There's a journalistic dictum: if it bleeds, it leads. But stories of crisis are always much more interesting to the media and to readers than stories of success. So we have to remember that a great deal has been achieved by the European Union, and it's not fair to just look at this European Union or Eurozone crisis and think that this really summarizes everything about the European Union. And then finally, we also need to remember that the United States also faces numerous crises and has faced crises many times during its history. But one of the differences is that people in Europe now, some of the more pessimistic people, are starting to say, well, the European Union is not working, let's just give it up, or let's completely reorganize it. Now, nobody really says that about the United States. People say, yes, we have problems here, but it's a project which is worth working on and fixing and making work better. So you've got 5 different sources of all of these problems. In terms of the Eurozone crisis specifically, a lot of very bright and well-paid and well-educated people have tried to come up with answers to the sources of the Eurozone crisis. I'm going to give you 3. Number 1, the euro is badly designed. The European Union institutions were given control over setting interest rates, the European Central Bank specifically, but they were not given control over fiscal policy, specifically over checking the spending, the budgets of the member states. Taxing is what's called a red line issue. Most member states don't want to give up control over taxes. But the idea of allowing the European Central Bank to keep an eye on the spending policies of member states was a good idea, which was not tried from the outset. Secondly, the second cause of the Eurozone crisis has simply been bad luck. Now, the euro was flawed, and those flaws would have come out at some point in the future, but we had the global financial crisis when it came, and that had a knock-on effect which set the Eurozone crisis off or brought it out more quickly than it might otherwise have been the case. And then the third cause of the Eurozone crisis is simply bad decisions. And I hope there's not too many Greeks or Greek apologists in the audience, but the biggest mistake that the European Union made was to allow Greece to join the euro in the first place, because it clearly did not meet the terms of membership of the euro. It simply wasn't ready. But even then, after the euro was created, Germany and Italy and several other countries broke the rules of membership of the euro themselves, the rules that they had created in the first place. So you had bad design, you had bad luck, and you had bad decisions. But then finally, the result of all of this is that Eurozone has been pilloried and mocked, and people have said the euro is a terrible idea, and political parties have been created to say we need to get out of the euro, we need to get out of the European Union. But let's look at the United States. I mean, the United States has had its problems as well. Look at the fiscal cliff, look at the sequester, look at this dysfunctional political system that we have, where Congress just seems incapable of reaching an agreement on anything important. And that leads me to another Economist cover, which I rather like, which came out earlier this year, which implies that the United States has become European. There's a broken system, a lousy deal, no end in sight. Does this apply to the Eurozone? Does it apply to the United States? Well, of course, it applies to both. There was actually rather a nice letter that was written to The Economist a couple of weeks after this cover appeared, in which somebody said, thank you for starting the 2013 off on a good note, because, look, we've got 2 very healthy people here who are obviously benefiting from national healthcare systems. We have clean, cloudless skies, so obviously climate change laws are working. Neither of these 2 is packing guns, so obviously gun control is working. But that rather got off the point. But still, it was a rather nice reaction to that cover. Now, why does all of this matter for the United States? Well, there are multiple reasons for this. First of all, the European Union is the wealthiest marketplace in the world. It is bigger than the United States. It's 2 times bigger than the marketplaces of China and India combined. The European Union is a substantial economic actor in the world. Secondly, it's the biggest trading bloc in the world. It's the biggest trading partner for the United States. And we're now talking about the possibility of a transatlantic free trade zone if the United States and the European Union can work it out. And that's going to have enormous implications for both sides in this partnership. Thirdly, the European Union and the United States account for two-thirds of all foreign investment in the world, and much of that is transatlantic flows. The Europeans invest in the United States invest in the European Union. Fourthly, whatever problems the euro is going through at the moment, it is the only substantial global currency out there besides the US dollar. Certainly we have the Japanese yen, and we have the British pound, and we have the possibility of a Chinese currency perhaps at some point in the future. But for the time being, the euro is really the only currency that really competes or comes to look anything like the US dollar in terms of its credibility. And then finally, the European Union has the second largest military in the world after the United States. Okay, they don't have a common military policy, and sometimes it can seem that the Europeans are not really doing their bit in terms of standing up to security issues. But still, you add together the militaries of the 27 countries, and this is the second biggest military in the world. And then finally, the European Union and the United States, whatever they think about each other and whatever they say about each other, at the end of the day, they are each other's two most reliable political allies. Finally, to wrap up, where do we go from here? Well, I'm a bit unusual in the sense that I'm British. I'm actually American as well, and I have two passports. And I'm an optimist about the European Union and about the euro. I've always thought the euro would get past its current problems, and I can continue to think that it will. I've always thought that the European Union was a good idea, and I continue to think that it will be in the future. All that we need to do, and I say all that we need to do because it's really a tall order, is to get both of these entities to function better. It's very clear at the moment that austerity measures are not working. What we need in the European Union and in Europe more broadly is economic growth policies which will allow Europe to get back on its feet and make people feel more positive about the European Union and also get the euro to function more effectively. Now, there are three things in particular that we need, and I'll finish up with these three suggestions. And I say them, this is a shopping list that I have as if we can achieve these very easily, which of course we can't. It's going to take hard work. But first of all, we need more democracy. We need new efforts to engage Europeans in the European Union, because many of them are disengaged, they don't really understand the European Union, and they allow themselves to be affected by myths, by misconceptions, and by the Eurosceptic media and by Eurosceptic political parties in Europe, which tell them the European Union is not working well and is busy trying to steal away all of their democracy and sovereignty, which simply isn't true. So what we need to do is to try and get Europeans to better understand the way the European Union works and the way the euro works and what is good about the euro as well as what's bad about the euro. Secondly, the European Union institutions need to become more efficient. They need to be more open. They need to be more transparent. They need to make more of an effort to engage Europeans, to bring them in, to make them feel that they're part of this common exercise. And then finally, there's a great deal that is still undone in the agenda of European integration. Many of the complaints that are directed at the European Union are directed at ways in which the EU seems to be involving itself in domestic affairs to an extent that is harmful. In actual fact, many of the problems of the European Union don't come from the fact that Europe is becoming too involved, but the fact that it hasn't become involved enough. And there are substantial sections of European policy that still need additional work. For example, the market in financial services. One of the achievements of Europe is they've opened up a market in trade in goods, for example, but in financial services there are still many blocks to trade within the European Union, and that really is harming the process of European integration. With that, I will stop, and I hope that I've given you some background in terms of where Europe has come from and where it might go to, but I would reiterate the point that the European Union has many problems. It always has done, it always will do, in much way the same way as the United States always has done and always will do. But that doesn't mean that we should give up on this exercise, and indeed, on the contrary, we should work harder at trying to identify the specific problems it has and fixing them. Thank you very much.
Lecture format, so I didn't know if I should stay in the armchair or not. Professor McCormick is unfortunately unable to join us in person, so doesn't get to appreciate the best attribute of the Great Decision series, which is nothing could be more European than being given, in addition to a glass of water, a glass of claret to enjoy during the academic presentation tonight. So he'll have to nurse his indignation in Indianapolis. Also, I wanted to say, I don't need that, right? Yeah, okay. I want to say that as a Canadian who now works in the States, we joined the expat group of academics who have infiltrated your culture. But I can see and raise a third passport with my EU one and my Canadian one and my American one. So you have a cultural diaspora here of academics opining on the European Union and on the American consequences thereof. Okay. So what I would like to do is follow up on this actually wonderful discussion of Professor McCormick's about the European Union and the crisis. From the perspective of someone who does bankruptcy law, and I'm a law professor, so I worry about tawdry things like collective action problems and finances, and I find the European Union a fascinating issue because basically it is the quintessential collective action gamble politically. And so what you have by linking arms together with a common community and a common currency is the idea that for the benefits that collective action solving brings, that is to say the benefits of reduction of trade barriers and reduction of political barriers and the gains of that trade, you have to give up a certain amount of sovereignty. And here in the European Union, you've seen some relinquishment of macroeconomic policy. And in the wonderful sort of muddle through, ad hoc, pragmatic, not too specified way that Europe lays claim to, the European Union had the integration of the common currency of the euro with some sovereignty preserved, right? You saw that there was release of fiscal policy over the interest rates, but preservation of the spending policy, macroeconomic policy, monetary policy and spending, preservation of fiscal policy. So what does that mean? That means if you all lock hands together and go into a common currency, then that means you have to be pretty comfortable with who your partners are in the common currency. And so I apologize for those of you who are familiar with this macroeconomic issue already, and I don't mean to condescend to you, but for those of you who are not familiar with it, basically that means the way the world market punishes and disciplines intemperate sovereigns is by depressing the currency, right? So if you want to run a huge budgetary deficit year after year after year, your currency will be suppressed. And you can print all the, fictitious dollars of your currency or whatever it is that you want to, but eventually no one's going to take that debt. Okay? So by going together in the European Union, the countries had to all agree that they would be together in a common currency that was linked to other members of the state and would rise or fall based on their monetary policy, or so their budgetary policy. So if you have, by analogy, a cousin who spends like a drunken sailor, and you agree you're going to go on his credit rating, you have a problem. Right? So they said, well, we're going to have rules, right? Everyone in this club has to follow the rules, so no one can have more than a 3% budgetary deficit per year, right? Out of the gates, they're conceding they're all going to run budget deficits, they can't balance their books, but no worse than 3%, okay? And they couldn't keep with that from the beginning, right? Even the major players, the major economies could not, the 3% budget was a stretch for France and Germany and Italy as well, okay? And so right out of the gates, in my opinion, the European euro currency was in trouble. Now they started letting new people in the club, right? People with demonstrated habits of less temperate spending. And by most recently, you have 17 nations in the European Union's Eurozone. Slovakia was let in 2009. And the 3% target's gone by the wayside. Greece, for example, its budgetary deficit was up in the teens as a percentage of its gross domestic product, and it now has a total aggregate gross domestic product well over 100. It's about 160% is Greece's debt of its GDP. So what does that mean? That means the value of the European currency has been drifting down, drifting down, drifting down. Okay? Which is, of course, irritating to the people who have been trying to hew a closer budgetary crisis, but that's what you get when you go in as a team. So what do you do as a response? Well, you can cut loose the dead weight, but then you've conceded that collective action resolution is a failure, or you can't have a collective common currency. And I join Professor McCormick and think that would be a terrible idea, and that you should try to muddle through and come up with some way to support the currency of this new zone, because there are aggregate trades advantages to doing so. And so that's why you have seen, right, the major economies like Germany and France going in to support Greece, and not just cutting them free from the euro and letting them go back to the drachma. Right? There is a belief that we should try to keep this project together, that it is to Europe's collective benefit, and they just have to ride through the current economic climate. How did they get so much debt? Did they spend like drunken sailors? Well, sort of, yes, but that's a little bit unfair. Starting in the 90s, debt costs were very low, and so it was attractive to borrow capital at the public sector. And I should say, these economies in Southern Europe, too, were growing, and there were great productivity gains, and so it's not necessarily rational that they were building up the public debt. The problem is that when the recession hit in 2008, and this is one of the consequences of globalization, not trivially driven by exposure to the US real estate market, right? You started to have a collapse of the public sector, and particularly the banking sector in these European companies. Sorry, that's Freudian for a bankruptcy person. Countries, I should say. Failure of the banking sector in these countries. So what is to be done? Well, there's a vicious cycle that starts. When confidence is lost in the economy of a country, capital starts to withdraw, flees to safer places, okay? And that creates liquidity constraints on the industry within the country that needs to borrow more, right? So they lose capital, and therefore they have a harder time staying afloat economically, and the cycle perpetuates itself. The workers of the country also start to constrict their consumption, and everything goes downhill from there. Take Ireland. Ireland was a very interesting example. So Ireland grew tremendously during the 90s, and it had a GDP ratio, debt to GDP ratio of only 25%, which is way better than Canada, the United States, or UK, any. The problem is, when the real estate crisis started in the States and the global economic contraction hit, that the Irish banks started to falter, okay? And if your banks falter, then you're in big trouble. And so the Irish government made the decision, in my opinion, correctly in retrospect. It came in and said, we are going to guarantee the solvency of Irish banks. So we don't have a panic. We don't want people running on the Irish banks. The government of Ireland is good for the debt of Irish banks. So they put like the full faith of the sovereign behind the Irish banks. So that's great. But then what happened to the public balance sheet? It meant that Ireland became increasingly indebted as it vouched for these debts of its banking sector. Right? To pay for the lack of a panic, they had to vouch for the banking sector debts. Number two, they put in Keynesian stimulus policies by doing public spending as well as all the European countries, as we did too in this country as well. Okay, so doubled down on public expenditure. So what do you have with Ireland? Ireland went from 25% debt to GDP ratio to something like 100% now, over 100%. So it's hugely indebted. Okay, yes, Greece had some of what I call the drunken sailor problem, but part of Greece is just being dragged down by the economic factors of the global recession as well. So I will agree with Professor McCormick that it is premature to abandon the euro. It's just we're in a difficult economic climate right now, and will be continuing to be so for some time, given the heavily indebted nature of these government balance sheets. Why should the U.S. care? Should the U.S. care? Should we bask in jingoistic isolationism? No, we can't. We don't have that luxury, right? We have all sorts of trade we do with Europe, at a trade deficit of $65 billion in 2011, up to $116 billion in 2012. We sell a lot of our stuff to the European Union. About 14% of our exports go to the European Union right now. Their fate is linked to our fate. So we encourage the bailouts that the sovereign countries are doing there to their less fortunate peers, and indeed the creation of the European Stabilization Fund, or mechanism it's called. Basically, what happened is they put about 500 billion euros into this workout fund, like a mini IMF for the European Union, and that is going to provide loans and assistance to the countries that are struggling more within the European Union. Now, imagine every political economy nightmare you have about collective action and how these government institutions are run with multiple sovereigns, but for all that muddling through, it is a good idea, and it does need public support. The idea of what I'm going to call quasi-sovereign institutional coordination through this emergency European stabilization mechanism has been helping with the bailouts of Greece. right? So 100 billion or so put into Greece. And what's referred to as a troika, which is this emergency stabilization mechanism, plus the European Central Bank, the one that sets the fiscal policy, and even the IMF is in there as well. So you see a bailout of Greece, you see austerity programs imposed upon Greece to get its spending under control, and you see the risks of what can happen when there is financial panic. Right? And those of you who've been reading the headlines have seen what's been going on in Cyprus just over the past week or so, right? If you have a panic in the economy, people run on the banks, and that's something we thought we figured out that we would never go back to after the Great Depression in this country. Okay? A loss of confidence without private sector support can be catastrophic for an economy. What happens with the automotive sector in particular? Okay, the European automotive sector is having the same difficulties that the American automotive sector had a half decade ago. It's just that they haven't dealt with it yet. It's perhaps the wine, I don't know. But they have been avoiding some of the difficult decisions that we painfully encountered in 2008 with our own sector here, and that should be particularly acute to people based in Michigan. We make about 80 million cars over the planet a year as a rough idea, and a third of them are made in Europe. And Europe, much like Michigan, actually, I think this is a good comparison. It's not just the economic significance of cars in Europe, it's something wrapped up in the popular zeitgeist. They have plants everywhere in Europe. People make cars. They sort of use that as a calibration of how the nation state, the polity or whatever is doing. There are 250 car plants scattered throughout Europe in 18 countries. Automotive sector is 6% of the European workforce. Okay? It's a big, important chunk of the economy. Now, demand. About 18 million cars sold in Europe in 2008. When we went into the recession, 2012, that was down to 14 million cars. Okay, so that's a $4 million drop. I can't do the math in my head, about 30% or so. Huge reduction in demand. What's happened to supply? Well, of those couple hundred plants, Europe has closed 3 in the past 5 years. And one of them was Saab, okay, which already closed up. What does that mean? I don't think you need to be taking microeconomics to know that that's a disjunct, right? That's not a balance of supply and demand. Europe has a huge, embarrassing overcapacity problem. And the economy is not going to recover fully until that is confronted, right? You just have to reduce the automotive supply sector in Europe. Rule of thumb I learned by reading about it, because I know nothing about the sector independently, is that you need about a capacity utilization rate between 75 and 80% for car plants to be profitable. Best estimates is that after the restructuring of the American companies, we're up above in the 80% of capacity utilization, maybe even pushing 90s by some estimate of some of these plants, because we closed a ton, right? Europe's capacity utilization rate is about 60s. They're in the 60%. And so on an aggregate level, that's not enough to run a profitable industry, which spells the recipe for disaster. The demand level for cars in Europe are right now around the 1995 levels, and the capacities continue to grow. So, what has to be done? Close capacity, right? That's what you would say. Well, easier said than done. C'est la vie, Europe, France in particular. No one wants to close plants. Duh, no one wants to close plants. It's really hard to close plants in Europe, as I've learned. What you do is propose closing plants 2 or 3 years hence, and then people start lighting cars on fire and kidnapping the manager of factories. And if you're lucky, you negotiate with the workers as how many 100,000 euros they will get as their severance packages. Okay? It's a big, big deal. Look, there's a lot to be said for fraternity. They don't rip people apart anymore, so there's been improvement socially in the past couple hundred years. Don't judge people. And they're just going to throw Lincoln in our face in our own history here, so, be careful. So, who comes with capacity utilization first? It's the brash gauche Americans, and Ford comes and announces it's actually going to start closing plants, reducing by about 18% in October 2012. This leads to the fires I mentioned before. And they have the numbers to back them up. According to their estimates, they lost a couple $2 billion on their European sales in 2012. GM's lost a couple $1 billion as well. They said we could close 3 plants and cut our costs by $500 million, just cost cutting right there. Okay, so we're going to do it, and that's the way we do it in the States. And that is receiving, as I said, terrible social unrest as a response. I want to, and General Motors doing as well, closing the plant in Bochum. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly in Germany. Bochum is closing it. Peugeot is closing one in a Parisian suburb called Albany-sur-Bois. 8,000 workers there, and they just have they have protesters coming out of the woodworks. You can have a union protest with 1,000 people showing up in Paris, no problem at all. okay? Very politically painful for the elected leaders. And remember, France just elected Hollande to replace Sarkozy, right? So you have a socialist in there. He's got to show how tough he is fighting, right, the man and his hegemony and how he's going to stick up for the workers. So very difficult politically to be behind the car loans, particularly so when you're investing government money, right? Peugeot got something like a $7 billion loan, or sorry, 7 billion euro credit guarantees from the French government. And, you know, there's quid pro quo. So when you give credit guarantees, you're not going to be favorably received if your usage of those funds is to start reducing the workforce and firing people. I want to talk a little bit about the segmentation of the European automotive industry. Yes, it's bad and it's horrible and it's got overcapacity, but there is regional variation. Regressively, I suppose, the north is doing better than the south. So some of this demand numbers are down by 40% in the southern European countries, which exacerbates the financial distress that Greece is hitting. Whereas like German car sales in the US are actually up by 21%. This gets into the second point, which is product segmentation and differentiation. The idea is right now the premium cars are doing pretty well in Europe, and there's still good demand for them. So you have BMW, Volkswagen are trading at multiples of like 7 times plus earnings, whereas the lower end ones like the Fiats and the Peugeots are down at 4 times earnings. Ford and GM kind of occupy a middle market position, as I understand, in Europe. So what happens? Well, the government is coming in to help, just like they did in the United States. Right? We had our own automotive bailout here, and the companies were forced into bankruptcy, Chapter 11 reorganization. Now, what happens when you close companies through the Chapter 11 process? Well, people get upset and they litigate, and we have stuff working out through disgruntled dealers in the appellate courts, and that works its way. But the government, and this is, I believe, and we can talk about this in Q&A if you want to fight me on this, but I think it's a largely bipartisan thing where we had both the Bush administration and the Obama administration providing capital to the organization of the car companies here. And I think charitably what they said was there was a failure of the financing market. The credit crunch in 2008 made it impossible for these companies to borrow money to restructure, so the government stepped in. And the government stepped in and acted what we call as a dip lender in the bankruptcy world, which is a lender to bankrupt companies who are going through a reorganization. And no one else, right, all the other banks were too scared to do it because they had their own problems. And like a financier, the American government, I think, acted like a banker and not like a government. What do I mean? It means it's trying to unwind its position. There was maybe some squabbling about the window dressing of who the CEO was and whether to kick him out. But generally, the government, I don't think, has been involved in day-to-day operational decisions of the American car companies. Contrast the situation to Europe, where the French government, in exchange, has extracted demands for the slowing of the closing of factories, and has also instituted, just so you know, the French government now has a board seat on, I think it's Peugeot, and even GM had to buy a 7% stake in Peugeot. So for this French government investment, what you've seen is bold new announcement that 25% of the car production will be in hybrid and electric cars. Coming out of Peugeot and Fiat. Now, that may be wonderful and that may be great as a normative policy for environmentalism. I have no reason whatsoever to believe that has been driven by market forces in Europe, right? I believe that is policy setting by the French government, and God bless them. But you see a very, in my opinion, heavy-handed involvement, which is not the path that was taken by the Americans, and I think that will have, in my prediction, difficult economic consequences. Monsieur Hollande has said that his goal for the closing of the Aubigné-Sous-Bois plant is to have no straight firings. I don't even know what that means as a bankruptcy professor. Maybe he's anticipating a bulge year where there'll be 8,000 retirements in 2013 that he's hoping for. Or there's talk about converting it into a components, but we won't build cars and we'll build components, or maybe there'll be a compliance center there. Possibly, I suppose, you know, as an academic, epistemologically, we can't exclude that as a possibility, but I think it's very unlikely and sounds to me more like political rhetoric and pipe dreaming. But that's from the cynical pronouncements of a professor with tenure, so who doesn't have to run for re-election. In Germany, they're negotiating. So in Germany, they've announced that they're going to close the Bochum plant, and now they're negotiating how long it will take them to close the plant, and so this is what unions do, and what sort of benefits the workers will get. So they were negotiating over whether it should be 60,000 euros as the payout package per employee, or the union was holding out for 130,000 euros per employee as the payout package. And the company says, if you guys hold out, we're just going to, this is what they're negotiating leverage, we're going to close the plant earlier. to punish you. We're still closing it, right? They're just fighting over the end game. And what I understand recently is, I didn't see this news story, is apparently they've called the unions bluff, and they were going to originally close it in 2016, they're now going to say they're going to close it in 2014. So we've gone the way of the baker workers who do the Twinkies. In France as well, there's something called social charges. I don't think I have time to get into that. What's most interesting to me, if we're talking about market forces and government forces, and on February 13th, there was some discussion about France considering a strategic investment in Peugeot, right? Taking a book from the Obama playbook, that they could, invest more money to help prop the company up in its restructuring effort for an equity stake. And the initial reaction is, it's not clear that Peugeot wants the money. And I think that for a company that's going bankrupt, to decline an offer of financing is a screaming signal about their concerns of the policy direction that might be injected under those circumstances. It's a drowning man declining a life preserver under the circumstances if it comes from this party. So there could be stuff going on behind the scenes that I don't know. And there was a funny thing where I think they called the budget minister, Monsieur Cusack, said something where they caught him on mic, and they said, well, obviously we can't stop the plant from closing. And he got overridden by his peers. Like, no, we're going to fight very hard for keeping this stuff open, so pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. So we will see what happens, but I'm not too optimistic. Now, again, I cannot emphasize enough, 3 plants closed in Europe. Over the same period of time in the United States, we went from 36 car plants to 28 car plants. That's a reduction of about a quarter of our capacity. We had about 1.6 million automotive workers in 2000 at the beginning of the last decade. We now have, actually there's been an uptick, right, because of the recovery of about 600,000. So Europe has not gone through these painful issues that we've done yet, and they're going to have to do so, I think, for its automotive sector to become competitive. I want to close, if I can, on one quick point if we have time, which is the market is heterogeneous, and there's different sectors within the automotive sector, part of the economy. I don't want to say sectors twice. So what's interesting is as the OEMs, the guys who make the cars, are having these big problems, the Tier 1 guys are actually doing much better. The Tier 1 suppliers in Europe, there's companies like Valeo and Faurecia, if I'm pronouncing it properly, who are sort of like their analogs of Dana and Lear and stuff like that, are doing much better than the main car. And you'd think that their fates would be linked, right? There'd be a high R squared to how their performances are. Why? 2 reasons. Number one, diversification. The suppliers have started to diversify. They're no longer all going to one person. So, for example, Faurecia that came out of Peugeot and actually now sells a ton of its supplies to Volkswagen. Okay, and Valeo has reduced, which is a French company, has reduced about 23% of its sales to France down to 19%, and it's selling a lot of stuff to Asia now. So there's more diversification in there. And number 2, political cover. These guys aren't as politically salient, right? I said it's a big deal in the European zeitgeist. And so when these guys started hitting economic stress, they just closed plants and they fired people. And they did it all under the radar without any of the outrage that the major manufacturers got. And so they were able to reduce capacity. And as a result, you see them doing well. So the question is, how does this affect us here in Michigan? I don't know. On the one hand, it creates a good picture for Tier 1 suppliers who can compete if they're nimbler, if they've reduced their capacity and they have diversification like the American ones do. And indeed, Lear's margins held constant in 2012. They're selling seats to China. Their debt was just upgraded to BB+. Dana Corporation, too, has less than 25% now of its sales driven by the American market, and there's a plant opening up in Michigan, Mendon, Michigan, by IAC. On the other hand, the European guys are doing pretty well, too, so that means more competition, right? It's a thick, competitive market. I can say this, demand will be going down, right? Demand's going to be going down in Europe as the capacity gets corrected there. But I have to say that I'm net optimistic because I think the restructuring, the painful restructuring that we did 5 years ago that you're still seeing was something necessary to keep our automotive industry alive. You see now the scaling out of the government, right? It came in and acted like a real dip financer, not like someone mandating, greenhouse gas emissions and whatever. And now it's pulling out and letting the market do its thing. And I don't think Europe has done that yet. They're trying to do it, but we'll see. But the proof will be in the souffle, I guess. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much to both speakers. Very interesting presentations with somewhat different focus, but sort of rounding out the picture. First of all, thanks for having me and letting me moderate this discussion here. I will keep my questions to a minimum. I'd rather invite the audience later, or sooner rather than later, to chime in here. I'm sure there are plenty of questions, but first let me ask John McCormick, can you hear me in Indianapolis?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Sorry you couldn't be here with us today, but you know, your presentation is here, so that's almost as good as having you here in person. So let me start out with a question that is perhaps foremost on people's minds tonight, and that, of course, is the question concerning the deal that was struck last night between the Troika, the Eurozone finance ministers, and the Cypriot government. I'd simply like to, both of you, both John in Indianapolis and John Pottow here, to give us your assessment of what this deal means. Does it mean that the Cypriot banking sector is going to survive? Does it mean that the Cypriot government is going to be fine? Does it mean that the euro is going to muddle through one more time? Just a brief assessment of the deal that was struck last night in Brussels. And we'll start with John in Indianapolis, please.
Okay. I should first of all say that John Pottow's got a much better background in this area of banking and finance and law than I have. I'm a political scientist, so let me just look at this from a political perspective. What I understand about finance and economics in general is that the key is ultimately confidence. If there's a lack of confidence, things are going to go bad. If there's improved confidence, things will improve. Now, there's been staggering from one crisis to another with the Eurozone. This is in large part because they didn't really know what to expect, because they were really walking through or sailing through uncharted territory. I think that the Cypriot crisis will be resolved, and there may be other crises that come in the future, and they will be resolved. And the reason for this, ultimately, is that, to borrow the phrase from the great financial crisis, is that the collapse of the euro is just too big a failure to allow. It just cannot happen. It cannot be allowed to happen, simply because the cost of failure of the euro would mean ultimately probably the collapse of the European Union, and that's not what the people in positions of power really want. And in that sense, they're going to use everything they can creatively to fix these problems, and so I think the Cypriot problem will be fixed, and I think the next problem, wherever that comes from, is going to be fixed, and at the end of the day, I think the euro will survive.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good for a political scientist, eh, John? Yeah, I agree with you that it's all about confidence. So there are two major Cypriot banks, and remember I said this gets back to the banks too, and so they are failing, and they need a bailout. So the question is the distributional one of how are you going to finance the bailout? Who's going to put in the money? And so I suspect somewhere an economist was behind this and said, well, we should have all stakeholders come together and contribute to it, including, the deposit holders, right? They've got money at the bank, so they benefit from the banks being there. They use those ATMs and stuff like that. So let's tie them 6% of their account. And you want to talk about confidence. What that basically means is you've just lost 6% of your bank account. And that is the quintessential run-on-the-bank panic. I mean, did you see the news stories of people running to the ATMs in Cyprus? And that's what we're never supposed to have happen with a consumer banking system, right? That's why we have the FDIC in this country. So the outrage of the Cypriots was, in my opinion, not surprising at all whatsoever. I think there are people who are genuinely surprised, like, oh, I had no idea they'd be so much upset over this. I thought it was a very balanced approach. We're asking everyone to contribute a bit. So then they sort of backpedal and said, okay, well, no. What we'll do is we will ask for contributions, but only for people above 100,000 euros in the banks. And that's basically sort of like our FDIC insurance, right? We say you're insured up to whatever it is, $250,000, and then you're on your own above that, right, if the bank fails. So I think people are freaked out. And the reason why Cyprus got such headlines is Cyprus is like the canary in the coal mine of Europe. You talk about a currency failing where people are having a run on the banks and losing their money. That's what causes a collapse in confidence. And so the policymaker realized that we can't have that. So they went back. They took less out of the depositors, still some, but the rank and file are still protected if you believe that having $100,000 in a bank account is pretty rank and file, which I do. And they're going to let one of the banks fail. One of the two Cyprus banks, they're just going to fail and liquidate it and fold in. Actually, I think the idea is to fold in some of its good assets into the good Cypriot bank. And they're going to wipe out, which is what they should have done. Well, okay, I'm proselytizing, but they're going to wipe out the equity holders and the debt of the banks as well in Cyprus.
All right. John McCormick, you talked about sort of the root causes of the crisis. Bad design initially, a monetary union without a fiscal union. But I'd like you perhaps to say a little bit more about some of the political obstacles that European political leaders are facing in addressing the crisis. I'll just give you one statistic here, that since 2009, of the 17 Eurozone governments, of the governments of the Eurozone member countries, out of those 17 governments, 10 have now been replaced. They have been ousted, votes of no confidence, or they had to resign. They have been replaced in elections. What does that tell us as the European Union leaders are muddling through this economic crisis?
It's difficult to know why those governments failed to be re-elected, for sure. Some of them fell as a result of what's happening in the Eurozone. But I think that the leading political problem in the last couple of years has certainly been the fact that everybody is looking to Angela Merkel or to Germany for leadership. She has been playing a very difficult domestic game because she has an election coming up very soon. The German consumers, the German population, is resentful that they have behaved fairly well over the last 3 or 4 decades in terms of economic management. And Germany has been very successful, and they don't like the fact that countries like Greece that have patently misbehaved are allowed to be bailed out or to be expected to be bailed out. So there's domestic political problems that have to be weighed up against the overall political good of promoting going ahead with the euro. Now, in economic terms, the euro is supposed to be the final step, or one of the large final steps, on the creation of the single market. You can't really have a functioning single market or an effective single market without a single currency. So at the end of the day, this has always been one of the goals of European integration, because the European single market has been around since the late 1950s as a goal, and it was always understood that the single market would be capped by the single currency. So there are going to be political pressures. Now, how much of these political pressures are just domestic electoral timetables? How much are they the result of fallout from the global financial crisis? How much are they concerned about the rise of right-wing splinter political parties, which are based as much on an anti-immigration philosophy as an anti-European Union or an anti-Euro philosophy? It's difficult to say. But I think we've seen more recently that the Merkel government has provided a bit more leadership. But it's always been a question of muddling through, and I think it's going to be a question of muddling through indefinitely, unfortunately. But that's part of the nature of politics in the democratic system.
Okay. Let me just briefly add to that. I mean, Angela Merkel probably is going to muddle through at least until September of this year, September 2013, when she will be facing a re-election battle. So at least until then, she's going to be very cautious in terms of the moves that she is going to take. I agree with you. Let me direct my next question to John Pottow. You talked a lot about the role of governments in shoring up some of those moribund or more or less weakened entities in the automotive industry, but you didn't say yet at least anything about the role that, for example, the European Central Bank is playing, and the role that Mario Draghi has been playing, and the role of the markets, the international financial markets. Do you see their role as positive in sort of disciplining some of those drunken sailors? governments, if you could...
I do.
Some people have blamed the markets for making the crisis worse. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. I think that the market is agnostic, or the market is neutral and the market is punishing. Yeah, by the way, I sound like some sort of mercantile free center, libertarian. I outgrew Ayn Rand in college sophomore year, people. So, I think that... no, I think it's just people looking for an easy scapegoat. And I think that's why you've seen all the political turnover too. I mean, unemployment in Greece is 27%. I don't think it's mystifying why there's been a lot of political turnover in the past little while. I think that the great value of the European Central Bank is, number one, they're trying to help, right, with an institutional framework for the monetary policy, and also setting, what I will call a technocratic example of experts, of saying, like, this is no longer a social issue, this is now sort of a numbers issue, and we need technocrats in there. And I actually think the ECB gets sort of indirect benefit for Monti, the guy who comes in Italy, where, you have all the drama of, intergenerational affairs, right, in Italian politics, and then you bring in this guy after the vote of no confidence saying we're only going to get through this, we balance the book. So I'm enthusiastic about the ECB's role, and I don't think this is... Remember, like a couple recessions ago in the 90s, everyone was blaming hedge funds. They're like, oh, it's all currency speculation. It's hedge funds that are driving the market. I don't think that's true. I think this is just I think the chickens of budgetary deficits have come home to roost.
Okay. All right. I think we probably want to move on to audience questions. So if anybody has a question, please come down and take the microphone. If you would perhaps briefly introduce yourself by name.
Certainly. My name is Rich Weber, and my question has to do with, as we deal with the European Union, the ethnicities of the countries. We've talked around about how the unionization has come forth, but what do you see the role in the diverse ethnicities as either playing against the union and delaying its full implementation, or is that a non sequitur?
Oh, I think that's an excellent question. I think that, the French and the English have been killing each other for centuries. And then when the European model was brought together, there was this idea of a multiplicity of ethnicities. Everyone would come together. My passport has 17 different languages and stuff like that. And in my opinion, when times get tough, people start scapegoating. And so I'm worried politically that when people are angry and they want to have change, it is a ripe environment for anti-immigration demagogues to come in and say, see, this is the problem. When you start hooking up with other countries and you start working together in a collective action, you have people like them dragging down our economy. And so I suspect poor old Chancellor Merkel is getting this on the domestic front, but I don't know enough about the German politics.
Let me see. Let me direct the question to John McCormick, to the political scientist. And did you hear the question, John? The question was about. Okay.
I did, yes. It depends on what you mean by the word ethnicity. I've long believed and argued that Europe is a multicultural society. I know that several political leaders have made speeches in which they've said that multiculturalism in Europe is dead or dying. I don't think that's true. What they were actually saying, what they meant to say, was that multiracialism in Europe is dead or dying. They just didn't dare say it because it would have been politically disastrous for them to have said as much. Europe is a multinational society. So the French and the British and the Germans and the Dutch and the Danes and so on, I think on the whole are generally very comfortable with each other. There's been some concerns recently about movement of Eastern Europeans into Western Europe, the infamous Polish plumber, and now a major concern about hundreds and thousands of Romanians moving to Britain, for example. But I think at the end of the day, Europeans are okay with each other as long as they're all white. And to be quite frank, I think there's a large element of racism involved, and the anti-immigration movement is directed at racial minorities and religious minorities. And that's what's been a complication for Europe recently, and it's going to become more and more of a complication because ethnic minorities, the percentage of the numbers are rising, and the number of adherents to religious minorities such as Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus is also increasing, and that's where the real problem is going to lie, not with the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese getting on with each other.
Is Chancellor Merkel running into right-wingers in her own country?
they are still fairly marginalized because it's sort of ethnic and racist, because of German history, you
Sure.
don't get very far with an extreme right-wing anti sort of.
What about that guy? Is Le Pen still around in France?
His daughter is now in charge. Marine,
it's a family tradition.
It is. Marine Le Pen is now in charge of the Front National in France, which is a strongly anti-immigration and a strongly anti-European Union political party. So let's turn it back to.
Thank you. My name is Pat Mears, and my question is kind of in the same area. We talked a lot about economic misbehavior and the European Union's ability to control that. What about political misbehavior? What are the tools? And I'm thinking of Hungary in particular. I think his name is Orbán, the president, seems to want to model Hungary as a Hungarian Reich. And you have restrictions on freedom of the press. You have a lot of cronyism, a lot of corruption. What weapons does the European Union have, if any, to correct this type of behavior, or are they kind of destined to lead a League of Nations existence where anything goes?
Well, as a lawyer, I can tell you from my one little perspective of law is they do have the European Court of Human Rights, and so that's a little bit of policing. And although not part of the union, I know that they were litigating against the Russian guy who the government came and took all his money, Yukos Oil, and he had some redress through the courts. Okay. So the institution of the European judiciary, I'm speculating, might provide some transparency on that when the aggrievement goes down to the private institutional level, citizen level. You might get some low on that, but other than that, it's beyond my expertise. I need to go to the political scientists.
Okay, I'll pass this on to John McCormick, but let me just provide a little bit of context, a little bit more context. The current Hungarian government won the last election very decisively, and they have a 60%, two-thirds majority in the parliament, in the legislature, which gives them the chance, the opportunity to change the Hungarian constitution, which they did, and in that change they restricted press freedom somewhat and put in place a couple of measures that made quite a few people in other places in Europe very anxious. So, but I'll pass it on to John McCormick. What instruments does the European Union have to discipline one of its, let's say, politically wayward members?
Well, I think you've got to tread fairly carefully here in terms of defining what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior. If a right-wing political party comes to power through the accepted electoral process and they win a free and fair fight, then you have to accept them. That is the choice of the voters. And there are no tools that are available or should be available on the part of the European institutions to respond to that. Of course, if parties start to break the law, if they start to impinge upon freedom of the press or start to interfere with the rule of law, that kind of thing, that's a different matter. And as the other John said, sorry, John, I don't mind me calling you the other John, the European Court of Human Rights is available as an option there. The European Court of Justice, to some extent, is also available, provided that only that European law is being impinged upon. The Austrian case is sort of interesting because we were worried a few years ago that the far right, was coming to power in Austria, and that didn't really happen the way that people thought it would. The rise of these right-wing political parties has to be put in context. I don't think they're really as big or as powerful or as important as we think they are, although, of course, we have to watch to make sure that that doesn't happen in the end. But if push comes to shove, the only tools that the European institutions really have, apart from the protection of European Union law, are budgetary tools. And the European Commission can deny assistance or redirect assistance or withhold financial assistance if rules are being broken. But off the top of my head, I can't think of any examples recently, or perhaps ever, when that has been necessary.
Okay.
My name is Hal Fruit, and I'd like to go at the economics a little bit. It seems that right now Europe is divided into two groups. There's the economic haves, such as Germany, and the have-nots, such as Greece. What power do the haves possess right now to define the economics of Europe to keep them in the have category going forward. So we have two complete separate classes of economic countries in Europe going as far forward as we can, with Germany being able to dictate now almost the economy for Europe and those haves.
So my reaction is as the reaction of a father raising children who realizes that I have a thin line of power control, and if they gang up on me, they'll realize that I have nothing. And so the nominal power that Germany has is the heavy-handed credit purse, right? So like, we're not going to bail you guys out. We're not going to bail you out. And this is like restructuring and bankruptcy, just like same with Chapter 11. If you call the bluff, you're like, really? You're going to kick us out of the euro and have the first failure of the European Union? I think if you hooked up a truthometer to Angela Merkel, she'd be like, no. But you can't admit that, or else your kids start smoking. So, I don't know. It's moral suasion, I guess, is my answer.
John McCormick, anything you want to add?
I like some of those analogies that John has presented there. One thing I would say is that I don't think it's as simple as saying that some countries are haves and some are have not, because within each country there are groups of haves and have not. So it's actually much more complicated than it would seem to say that the Germans have and the Greeks don't. So I think those have to be factored in when calculating the power relations that are going to develop. But Ireland proved, the country that was very, very poor, has suddenly become the Celtic tiger. Okay, it's no longer the Celtic tiger, unfortunately, for a variety of reasons. But it's quite possible that with the right kind of incentives and investments, that a country like Greece or a country like Cyprus or a country like Portugal or Spain, where the unemployment rate is now 25%, that all of these can come back around and they can provide opportunities for the so-called have countries, and everybody can come out of this in a better state of economic relationship.
All right, please.
My name is John Teamstra. I was wondering what you think of the prospect for further harmonization at the EU level of banking regulation. I mean, after Iceland and Ireland and now Cyprus, and with the Cyprus situation, I mean, if a bank fails in the United States, we haven't harmonized our banking regulation completely even after 150 years of working at it, but in this country, if a bank fails, it's gone the next day. The FDIC is in there, they're closed, everybody's paid off, and it's done. You don't see things like Cyprus. And I wonder whether there's a push on to harmonize banking regulation to the degree of deposit insurance and banking powers and things like that.
So my understanding is that there is growing support for this, and the ESM is keeping this alive. And perversely, I suppose, the ongoing crisis of Cyprus, et cetera, is keeping this as a salience event in the media. And so I do think that there is talk of greater control, building something off the UK Financial Services Board, like an Uber financial regulatory board in Europe. By contrast here, right, we had this big crisis response to the recession, and we had Dodd-Frank and all this stuff. We're never going to let it happen again. And now, my understanding, I mean, based on research of reading the newspaper, is that the sort of there's talk about like backpedaling on the financial reform we had in this country because it's gone out of the salience radar. So I actually think, although there's stronger institutional apparatus because we have a supremacy clause in the federal constitution here, there's more of a sort of ongoing, lingering, discontent social force in Europe, and I don't know what the net output of that's going to be.
Let me throw this question to John McCormick too. John, you had a nice slide where you listed all the crises that the European community and European Union has gone through since the 1950s, since its founding. And there are some people who argue that it is only in a time of severe crisis that the European national leaders will be able to come together, overcome their national interest, and are able to compromise. It takes a crisis for the European Union to make progress, essentially. The argument, some people go as far as say, it's only in a crisis that the European Union actually makes progress towards its ultimate goal of an ever closer union. Would you agree with that point? And do you see the current crisis as yet another crisis that might help the European Union actually to integrate more, integrate better?
No, I agree with that. And in fact, one of the quotes that I didn't give for Jean Monnet was that he came up with what became known as Monnet's law, which was essentially the argument that people don't really do anything until they're faced with the crisis. And then they're stuck with this crisis situation and they've got to somehow claw their way out of it. And I think, there have been many instances where the European Union has achieved a great deal without crisis. For example, one of my areas is environmental policy. In environmental policy, they've made their achievements really through stealth. They didn't know, back in 1958, at the time of the Treaty of Rome, nobody really talked about the environment back in the 1950s. And they had really no idea, or very few of them had any idea, that with the single market coming together, there would be various unanticipated blockages to the single market, which would have to be fixed as they went along. And one of those was environmental policy. If you have tighter environmental policies in some countries but looser ones in others, then the factories in the tighter countries are going to close and move to the looser ones. So they had to fix that problem and make sure that there was environmental law that was standard across the European Union. Now, that was done without a crisis. They weren't faced with a situation where they had to drag themselves out of a situation and a problem. So I think, going back to my point about the fact that they really didn't know what to expect with this very, very unusual exercise and experiment, and they made things up largely on the fly, this inevitably led themselves into situations of crisis. But there have also been many instances where it's just made sense for the Europeans to come together and to cooperate in different areas. And let me just say very quickly, I'm going to be so happy when these economic crises are over, because I'm just a political scientist, and I'd like to get back to the good old days and we could just talk simply about politics, which is just so much easier to understand than economics. Isn't that right?
Then we lose the narrative of the Nietzschean model of the European Union, getting stronger after each crisis.
Okay.
We have time for just one more question.
My name is Jerry Weddle. I just was wondering if the Eurozone and Euro can survive without a much stronger fiscal tie together like Euro bonds or something less than that. They seem to be working towards that, but that's something that nobody wants to talk about. Is it going to take just one crisis after another as they keep trying to get more of a fiscal guarantee or tie together?
Okay, so as a person, just like as an idiot, basically, right? Someone who doesn't have knowledge of the area specifically, I would predict that there's going to be an increasing trend towards convergence, and that there will be financial superstructure overseeing that, and that will lead towards greater financial oversight. And so, I don't know, the Europeans, they keep rejecting constitutions, but maybe there'll be some suggestion that if you get too far out of whack, that you have to consent to some sort of budgetary oversight. I don't know, but that's just speculation.
John McCormick?
I would have to defer to John on that one. Let me just finish off by saying that what's the adage about what does not kill me will strengthen me? And I think that very much applies to the story with the euro.
So we're back to Nietzsche.
All right. Well, thank you very much, both of you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Pottow, Dr. McCormick, and Dr. Hege for helping us to understand the Eurozone crisis and a hopeful understanding of the European Union for the future. Thank you. Also, thank you to those of you who have attended throughout the Great Decisions discussion series, and thank you to members of the West Michigan chapter of the Turnaround Management Association for tonight's collaboration. So you may be wondering what happens after Great Decisions. Well, we have two upcoming events we'd like to let you know about. One is World Quest. This is a very, very competitive trivia contest. So if any of you have been to it, you know it's a very convivial atmosphere and then a very competitive atmosphere of great international trivia. So that's Thursday, May 9th. Feel free to contact our offices if you're interested in joining a team or forming a team. And then also we have a session called Debriefing Qatar that's coming up in June. That's Tuesday, June 11th, and Diana Untermeyer will be here to speak about Qatar and her new book. So there'll be a reception, talk, and a book signing. So thank you again so much for being part of the Great Decision discussion series for 2013.